In 1939, he stood, when that place there was against him, he stood behind the British people and defeated fascism and the Nazi Party all across Europe. And you wouldn't be stood here today, young man, talking to me if it wasn't for Churchill. There'd be a different statue there, and there'd be swastikas flying over there.
That's a very smart man telling us about the importance of our history. And good day, good morning, good evening, whatever. It's again, You Can't Make This Shit Up stream. This is part 2 of the current trilogy, and with me are my partner of this series, the founder of this series, Sergeant Lawson, and our Texan friend Zero. So yeah, great the audience of absolutely 0 people.
For the time being.
For the time being, yeah.
Yeah. So to expand upon what was said in that little video clip, let me pull up a lesson from a book that has been quoted far too often in recent times as not being an instruction manual, but a warning. I'm speaking, of course, of Orwell's 1984, and this is a passage beginning at page 51 regarding the work of the Ministry of Truth. What happened in these unseen labyrinths to which the pneumatic tubes led, he did not know in detail, but he did know in general terms. As soon as all the corrections which happened to be necessary in any particular number of the times had been assembled and collated, that number would be reprinted, the original copy destroyed, and the corrected copy placed on the files in the stead. This process of continuous alteration was applied not only to newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, films, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs, to every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance. Day by day, and almost minute by minute, the past was brought up to date. In this was every prediction made by the party could be shown by documentary evidence to have been correct. Nor was any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. All history was a palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often as was necessary. In no case would it have been possible, once the deed was done, to prove that any falsification had taken place. This is describing what the Ministry of Truth has been doing.
Of Truth, you mean?
Yeah, the Ministry of Truth has been doing. And we are headed there fast. We have seen the toppling and defacing of monuments in the United States. This is hardly a new occurrence in the world, for such things have occurred in the past, but they usually were done for a very specific purpose. And this purpose always served an agenda. Be that the one originally employed by the Roman emperors when they condemned their predecessors to damnatio memoriae and destroyed their statues or had them reshaped to fit their own narrative, which in the end merely served to heighten our interest in these emperors. Then you had the medieval and Victorian moral Puritans who went around and either completely destroyed statues that they objected to, or at least cut off their genitalia or covered it up in some other way. Then you had the fascists and communists of the 1930s and 40s who went around demolishing the heritage that had been left by others who came before them, only to further their own agenda. How much invaluable history and monumentation has been lost to us. And then we, of course, continue on to the Islamic fanatics of these times who have gone as far as to destroy sites such as Palmyra, not only to further their own misled ideology, but also to fill their own coffers by selling off these priceless antiquities. How can we stand by and watch such things happen? This is the question we wanted to bring to bear in this little live stream of ours, even though we may have to cut it short since we ran into some constraints of our own. But before I ramble on too long, I shall give the word to my compatriots.
All right. That was a nice speech you had there. But anyway, you kind of missed one piece of history, and that was that the defacing of images isn't just, to Rome. It's far earlier even.
Yes,
The
of course.
pharaohs of ancient Egypt were actually very prolific when it comes to defacing their predecessors, especially when it comes to, them wanting to be better than them and then just replacing their names on monuments, etc., etc. You have examples from history where these things actually happen, and it took millennia to actually find the truth. And this is the lesson we want to kind of impart, and that's that history in general is filled with hardship. That hardship, no matter how gruesome, vile, evil, just make up a bad word, got us to where we are now and to the freedoms that we have today. And the freedoms to actually express our opinion, the freedom to go out and, protest even, peacefully protest, to, just settle our grievances with whatever authority there is. Grievances always exist. Let me be perfectly honest. Like, every single person in the world has a grievance, either with a friend or with themselves or even the powers that be. What needs to happen in every single one of these situations is to have a talk. Sit down and talk about the grievances. The grievances might be legitimate or might not be legitimate. That's only up to the people conversing in that situation. But a conversation still needs to happen. And that conversation needs to make both parties realize that the other party might actually have to say something. So when it comes to aggressive protesting and the defacing of statues based on your agenda, that's where you draw the line. You want to say that your history was so unbearable to you that you want to forget it, while at the same time forgetting that exactly those hardships got you the freedom to do that sort of thing. If, for example, there was no Winston Churchill, if there was no man like him, think of him what you will. Either he's a cunt or he's not a cunt. That depends on your, again, political agenda. He was the one who rallied the British against the Nazis. It's his speeches that gave them the motivation to fight on. You can find similar people to him in other nations that did the exact same thing, to rally their people against an enemy that they thought was evil and that we today think of as evil, that being, the bad people from World War II. So, and again, if we didn't have any record of these people existing, how would we know that Nazism, for example, is bad? How would we get to, for example, the civil rights movement if the group that was, African Americans were not inconvenienced in such a way, that is, being in slavery for, 100 years prior and then being segregated for decades? If they haven't had that grievance, and yes, that is a grievance, and that is a horrible thing to go through. If they haven't had that, the civil rights movement would not exist. We would not know that segregation was wrong. So we learn from history. We better ourselves by looking at the past and looking what's wrong and what's right. We all have to have that conversation, and that's my opinion on it. So, Zero, if you have something to say, go right ahead, my friend.
You're spot on with pretty much exactly what you were saying. Like, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. If we don't acknowledge the stuff that happened, and the reason why the statues are there are to help remind us of the stuff we went through. while some people might not like them, they're there to remind us the hardships we faced and that we've overcome them. So I don't, like you were saying, destroying it is not a good thing. You're erasing history, and those who forget it are doomed to repeat it.
Expand upon that, one cannot. For example, there has been argument to place these statues in museums, and though I welcome this argument a lot more than to merely go ahead and deface these monuments, thus degrading the memory and the deed of whoever is commemorated in such a statue. And the commemoration can be of a terrible or a good thing. This is not completely exclusive. But you can't just hide it away in a museum because, to be completely honest, how many youngsters these days dare visit a museum which they consider to be a stuffy old place filled with memories of a time they have no knowledge of? And despite learning about such a time, a lot of them shun these places. So I prefer the argument, but still, in the end, it is the same thing. You're trying to hide it away. You're trying to get rid of it in a way. And that is where I see the problem coming in. And this is why I would rather say to these protesters, go pick up a history book and read about it. And never, ever forget, history cannot be viewed through our modern day lens. You have to view it through the lens of a person of said period. And if you do not know enough about said period, then go read the history books. Go read the journals of those who came before us. Go learn how they thought. That is just I'm not expecting you to do a full-on university-style studying of history or to get a bachelor's degree like I did. But I expect you to understand that history is not, as you want to portray it, just this black and white affair. No, no, no. This is you trying to whitewash or blackwash or whatever you want to do to history. It is a revisionist approach to history because this is not how our world functions. Our world is divided up in so many shades of grey. Even though Dave used the argument of people from the 1940s being evil, and I will not say nay to that, but I will try to point out that one man's villain is another man's hero. And so to look at history just through our own limited lens is doing these people injustice.
Yeah, when you actually, when you, sorry for interrupting, but when you actually, for example, study World War II and you want to understand how it kind of came to be to that specific conflict and why it was fought, you can't just look at it from the Allies' side. You have to look at it from the Axis side as well. What was their motivation? And it's not so clear-cut, but because there were a few interviews, for example, with, like on the same table, there was a person from the Wehrmacht and there was a person from the RAF, for example. Both of them, they faced each other on the battlefield because I think that pilot kind of got shot down. He survived or whatever. Now, I'm kind of paraphrasing the facts here, but there were a British soldier and a German soldier sitting at the same table, and they actually did shake hands at the end of it. And even though they fought on the opposite side, there was still some kind of respect between these two peoples. And for example, the average German soldier, what was going through his mind when he was called to fight a war?
Yeah, that is a question that often gets neglected. And that is, for example, the criticism which was levied against EA when they first introduced Battlefield 1 and, of course, Battlefield 5, for they were only portraying one side instead of all sides. And this is why we need to understand history as this complex being that it is. It is not simply a thing of black and white.
Yeah, and then you have people like trying to revise history, going like, oh, they haven't been diverse enough, so we are introducing it into our own motion picture or game or whatever. That's not how it works. If you want to portray the historical period, you need to portray it authentically. So that means even portraying the demographic. It might not be in the modern sense of politics. It might not be representative of today's period, but you're not representing today's period. You're representing the period from 70, 80 years ago, it was a completely different time. And again, even 70, 80 years ago, the world was a completely different place. So, for example, the TV was very scarce. The radio was in every house, and some people today don't even know what the radio looks like because they've, grown up with smartphones, and they think the radio is in a phone. So nobody can actually, for example, realize how different life was just less than a century ago, let alone 200, 300, 400 years ago, when, for example, some of these monuments were erected, and the values that those people represent. And let me just show you one example of what I mean. If only this will, yeah, okay. So this is the monument we talked about in the previous stream, and we kind of fumbled around what it was. It's not from World War I. This is a Civil War monument dedicated to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment that was defaced by, as you can see, BLM protesters. At least we can, with some certainty, say that these were BLM protesters because we can see their signature on it. Now, ask yourselves, what was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment? I'll give you an example. So, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment looked something like this. Let me just share the screen again. And there we go. This is the Massachusetts 54th Infantry Regiment.
Completely comprised of black men.
Volunteers.
Volunteers. Even
These
though
were
a lot of
Union-
them were not brought forth to the front line, they rendered invaluable service as either logistics personnel, as guards for the POW camps that were set up in the north, or in some occasions, even as frontline troops. So you are demeaning the sacrifice made by these men who gave their lives, their blood, and their tears, so that you may enjoy these freedoms today. And to me, that is just despicable. It speaks and smacks of ignorance for your own history. And I just can't stand by and be silent about such a thing.
This is across the ocean for us in Europe. But it's still kind of, I don't know, it's strange that we across the ocean are kind of, in a lack of a better word, bothered by this, because again, something like this did happen in Europe as well after World War II, for example. A lot of monuments were torn down. History was tried to be forgotten, and it left a big gap in our knowledge of our past. And unfortunately, some of that past repeated itself again and again and again. I think Lawson can give you a good example of that because Germany went through that period.
Yes. Cool. You have the
And
East-West divide when you have Eastern and Western Germany, and both countries approach the recent history of the Second World War very differently. Or you can, of course, go to an even earlier example when the Nazis reappropriate the history of the First World War and respin that to basically further their own cause. History is a very delicate thing, and one should not trifle with it simply to make their own ideology or politics look better.
yeah,
And of course, you have what the Russians do when they destroy a lot of the monuments to the Tsar, when they go and, I mean, the most infamous version of this may not be defacing a monument, but it's very much akin to that. When Trotsky is just being relegated out of the picture by Stalin. I mean, this is a rather infamous incident. And
Yeah.
a lot of people know.
everybody knew about that one. Outside the Soviet Union, I mean. And the consequences of this is to completely eliminate Trotsky from the whole dialogue. Then later on, we found out that actually Trotsky was possibly even worse than Stalin, because he was a more expansion-oriented communist, as opposed to a Stalinist who was just, huddle in your hole, kind of industrialize Russia as fast as possible. But this wasn't just that. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of Soviet statues were also torn down. I think in the ex-republics.
Weirdly enough, this has led to a glorification of Stalin, a monster that literally wrote next to a signature ordering a mass execution, "Not enough."
So, in the end, even the West glorified the tearing down of these statues because it was the collapse of the great enemy of communism. And while I will kind of sympathize when it comes to victims of the regime, communism still happened. Why would you want to forget it?
You would be forgetting all the lessons you have learned from that command economies with a centralized structure, they don't work.
Now, I think we've rambled on about America in front of an American for too long, but we haven't given him a chance to speak his mind. So, Zero, you live in Texas, correct?
Yeah.
So in Texas, what happened through your own experience?
Well, where I live at, there's not really much going on, but in San Antonio and in Dallas, it was getting pretty damn bad. And they were threatening to attack the Alamo. That's not going to fly here in Texas. I promise you that. It's the Alamo is a very significant to Texas. They will stop them, guaranteed.
So when it comes to the Alamo, what is your knowledge of the Alamo? Why is it so important?
Well, because it was our independence from Mexico. And so, because I forget a bunch of the stuff that happened, but like that fight right there for the Alamo, like turned everything around. That signified the chance for Americans to win, and that it turned everything around.
Yeah. So I didn't ask you like a historical exam question. I just asked you like, what does it mean to Texas? But yeah, you summed it up pretty well. So
yeah, it mostly independence.
Yeah. So there you go. And there was also, I think, recently there was a shooting in New Mexico of one of the protesters because he attacked the man who actually instigated the squabble. I mean, he kind of pushed a girl aside, and that kind of got the crowd going after him. And then he pulled out a gun and shot a guy who actually had a knife. By the way, there was two knives. At least in some photos, I think you could see a second one, but still, one blade was clearly visible in this photograph and in the video in question. We're not going to play it right now because YouTube doesn't like that shit. But you can make an argument like, was he acting in self-defense? Then there was the other guys who said, oh, he instigated the conflict. But then you have the argument of, escalation of the conflict, etc. But the reason why the guy even quote unquote instigated the trouble was because the people there were defacing a monument in Albuquerque.
And though the statue in question or the monument in question, was to a governor of said region, a Spanish governor of said region, whom has been described by the leftist media as extremely brutal, though I would argue that they do lack a lot of context. The Spanish control of those territories was a constant war between them and the Indians, and if you, for example, know about the massacre that happened in the Superstition Mountains and stuff like that, you will understand why the Spanish sometimes were rather harsh masters in that region. But even so, you still shouldn't tear down that monument, because otherwise you would forget whom you are talking about. How else would you know about that particular governor and what he did? Because I can guarantee you, most of these people who are protesting that monument, they have never picked up a history book and read about this governor or the circumstances of his governance. So even if you dislike the monument, it still serves a purpose. And I will disagree with you that the man instigated the incident, because he just tells them, yeah, this monument is under our protection, shove off and let me go. And that is what leads up to him shoving that girl. But even then, he warns them after he has been beaten for the first time. I'm armed and I'm willing to make use of my sidearm. And he backs off. They still follow him, push him to the ground, and a scuffle ensues. And then he sees that guy that he shoots. You can hear him shout in the video, I'm going to effing kill you. So the guy does what is his legal right in the US. He makes use of self-defense and puts the guy down. And as we now know from close examination of the video, that Antifa thug had 2 knives. So I'm not condoning that violence, but this is where you are leading people. Because there's enough people who think akin to us and who are very much so against the defacing, toppling, and destruction of these monuments. And they will defend this property, because this is community property. This is public property. So you are not only destroying your own property, but public property. And tax money has been used to build these monuments. You have the chance to use the democratic process to vote in your local elections, to be active in your community, to get these statues removed if you so desire. But then it is by community consent, not by a rabble or a mob, because there still is something called the rule of law, which ensures the continuation of the social contract. If you break that social contract, well, you're basically throwing out all the rules, and then you're entering into a very, very dangerous arena, the arena of physical violence, and we have seen where that takes you. So think closely about what you are doing there.
Yeah, speaking about American monuments being defaced, one of the the one that got your blood boiling, Lawson, was this. Yeah, that's in front of I think it was a high school in Portland, Oregon.
Which we know is Antifa Central.
Antifa Central. And this is the statue of founder Thomas Jefferson, the guy who made the Declaration of Independence, and the guy who kind of, well, for lack of a better word, made America.
He was the 3rd president as well. A man who so wanted to get rid of slavery and try to push it in his original draft of both the Declaration of Independence as well as the Constitution. But he was outperformed and outmaneuvered during the discussions and debates that led up to the creation of both these documents. And even after then, he still tried to free his slaves several times, but the Virginia legislature just wouldn't let him. The man was not a good administrator on his plantation. Anyone who knows anything about him will attest to that. But he still treated his slaves very well. And despite this being contested, it is said that he fathered children with one of his slaves and treated them as his own. I know this has been contested by Orthodox historians, and some people have tried to bring DNA evidence to show that this was not the case, though this evidence has not been conclusive. But anyways, the man didn't want slavery. He was a slave owner against his will. So to tear down his statue and to insult him as such is doing the man more than just an injustice. It deliberately means you are defaming him as something that he was not. And you're defaming a man who can't defend himself, who has been smoldering in his grave for several centuries at this point. So I ask you, what do you truly believe you have accomplished apart from destroying public property and maybe enraging people such as me? You have made nothing but trouble and enemies. You have not destroyed his memory, nor have you changed history. You have done nothing but gratify your own little personal desire.
Zero, your comment on the situation in question?
That also boiled my blood when I saw that. I was really pissed off about that too.
A second.
This is. I am living in Europe, so Jefferson is not even one of my founding fathers. To see a man great as he was, and his memory being treated in such a manner is. I'm not an American patriot, but this still gets my blood boiling. This smacks of such a hubris, such ignorance.
It's still, you have to discuss when it comes to the actual Declaration of Independence, it did resonate across the entire world. That's why people fled to America in the first place. They heard of this land of the free, home of the brave. They got on. So then you have the European governments actually trying to emulate the same types of conditions that were in America.
Throw in that little tidbit because I just love that. If anyone is interested, go look up the Declaration of Arbroath during the Scottish Wars of Independence, which is pretty much the prototype and blueprint for what the American Declaration of Independence then becomes. It's a very cool little tidbit of history. And I really do love when the Americans, again, they're quoting Cicero several times. And the Declaration of Independence doesn't just come out of a vacuum. It is built upon all the values and history that Europe has accumulated. And you trying to destroy this history by defacing monuments, decrying it as racist and slaveholding and what have you, you would be the ones to prevent such a thing from occurring again. You're not helping your cause. You are hurting it. You have rammed it into the ground at this point, at least for people like me and myself. Well, me and others who have studied history. Sorry, that was a bad phrasing.
You and like yourself.
Yeah.
You mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of Scotland, because that was a very nice segue. So what happened in Scotland was also relevant to the situation. Yes, the statue of Churchill was vandalized, but that wasn't the only thing that was vandalized. And even I think the BBC made an article saying like, oh, these are all the Scottish monuments that were funded by slavery, and they literally just compiled a goddamn hit list. But the one that I wanted to point attention to is this one. Let me just share the screen.
Is it the memorial one?
No, is this. This is the statue of Robert the Bruce, the one of the freedom fighters for the independence of Scotland from England during the late 12 and early 1300s. Robert the Bruce was a Scotsman, a Scottish king, during the late 12 and early 1300s. Let's just say that Scotland was paler than snow during that time. It was populated mostly, like 90-something% by Scotsmen. The very rare brown person that you could see was often either an ambassador or a tradesman. When it comes to Robert the Bruce, and I think Count Dankula kind of put it better, most likely this man didn't know what a black looked like. and or a black person, apologies, what a black person looked like. Where are the pipes of Bannockburn when you need them? Yeah, so when it comes to something like this, where Robert was racist, bring down the statue. How could a man be racist if he doesn't know what a race is? I mean, to him, probably a race would be the English or the French.
Even then, even though you can attest that he hated the English, well, there was a good reason for it if you know the story. What they did to his family, that they killed his brother, imprisoned his wife for quite some time, and all these things. He had good cause, but that is just the reality of the wars of independence. Both sides are engaged in things that we would consider barbaric today. But that was just the reality back then. Or if you want to make the argument that he hated Muslims because he sent his heart onto crusade with his friend the Black Douglas, well, that was wars of religion that happened. And we, of course, can go into the whole debacle that led up to the Crusades and why the Crusades happened. But again, that is not a race. Islam is a religion, not a race.
Yeah, again, if you look at it in the context of the times, Europe was being invaded by Muslim invaders at the time, especially, Byzantium had a very big problem because of that. That's why they asked for help, and that's why the First Crusade ever came to be. Because the Seljuk Turks were constantly invading Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire couldn't defend itself, so the emperor sent a letter to Pope Urban to rally as many troops as he can to help him out. He was basically asking for mercenaries, not a full-blown Crusader army, but he got a Crusader army. And then it kind of evolved into, reclaiming the Holy Land and shit. But still, when you look at it from that particular context, this wasn't a race war or something like that. This was specifically defending Byzantium and taking back what the Christians thought was theirs, and that was the grave of Jesus Christ. And you can make an actual, quote-unquote, moral argument why they had to do that. So, again, thinking of it in that sort of context kind of gives you a better picture of how the world worked back then. And again, I say again, and again, and again, you cannot look at the past with the morality of the present. You will find only evil, or at least something that looks good on occasion. But mostly the systems back then were, to our understanding, inhumane. Serfdom, for example, in the medieval times was considered inhumane because the lord could basically tell the peasant, no, fuck no, you ain't going from this property because I own you, bitch. And he absolutely could do that. The peasants couldn't move to another fiefdom. They were tied to the land. This is why it's called serfdom. The serfs couldn't go away. Prior to that, you had the slavery system, which again, not even most of the world, all of the world worked on this system in antiquity. Everyone. We don't know about the North Americans because they still had the tribal system, but I'm assuming that
something like that. I assume,
yeah,
because
captured
we see stuff
from
like that later on when the British already are in the territories that we now recognize as America.
Yeah. We do know that we had a sort of hierarchy system in the Middle American and South American civilizations. And of course, you had the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak. So again, my apologies.
History is a process, not a process that will lead to a certain end or end point or goal. It is meandering and is complicated. So to assume that you can apply modern day standards, as we have pointed out before, time and time again, is just wrong, because you are playing with puzzle pieces that just didn't exist back then. So
Yeah,
your
just
argument
like
about
imagine.
slavery is
Yeah, imagine if you traveled back in time, let's just say to the time of Emperor Augustus, and you stood before Augustus and told him that he's a slave-owning piece of shit. He would basically just order execution because you called him a piece of shit. Do you know why?
because there was a completely different understanding of what it means to be free.
Exactly. There was a completely different understanding of human rights, for example. There were none. You had your rights as a citizen of Rome, for example, but even those could be taken away if your guilt was presented.
Or your debt. I mean, there was such a thing as debt slavery.
Exactly. You also had various systems which restricted human rights prior to, certain revolutions and understandings of what freedom meant. Especially when it comes to, for example, citizens' rights in the late medieval period, which kind of sprang up because, guilds were starting to form around these very large cities, which were expanding exponentially because of trade, because of generally economy. So people in those cities didn't want to be serfs anymore. So they drafted up their own rules and laws, which protected them. And that can all be traced back to Corpus Juris Civilis and to even later on a bit Magna Carta Libertatum. The Magna Carta Libertatum was basically the document that restricted the powers of the king. That was the first step towards, moving towards a parliamentary system. So, again, something needed to happen to, force these things into motion.
And we see modern day protesters. I mean, we already spoke about that in our first iteration of this podcast, on this topic. Now people are completely forgetting this, and they're regressing in time. I just, again, have to quote Martin Luther King Jr. in this sense. I have a dream that one day my children will be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. So to go back in time and now judge these men and women whose statues you are defacing for being whatever you want to call them, you are judging them for not where they are or the context of the times. You are literally insulting them as white people. I've seen that several times now regarding different monuments, and I think on the Churchill monument in particular, they called him that. So I'm like, no, this is just not how this works, and it just gets my blood boiling. So sorry
Zero?
if I'm not making too much sense.
Zero. Any comment?
Yeah, pretty much the same as Larson said.
Yeah, you've been eerily silent this podcast. Why is that? I mean, if we are taking up your audio time here, I'm sorry.
Oh no! It's
kind of go on a ramble.
I forget that you can't see my face. There's a bunch of stuff y'all say that I'm nodding to because I agree with exactly what you're saying, and I don't like to cut out people when talking, and so I usually quieter.
So, what is your opinion, for example, on these protests in general? Like from when it happened to today, as an American citizen? Tell us to us Europeans.
See, I don't have a problem with the protest, but the people that are rioting and looting, I have a huge problem with that. The same people who are protesting and then, well, not necessarily people, but like the governor of, I think it was Minneapolis, the one that he was saying that, oh, well, you can't open your businesses for your families, but you can go out and protest. The sheer hypocrisy pisses me off, like, to no extent. It's so stupid that they will be hypocritical about that. They'll say it on the news. Oh, you can go out and protest, but you can't open your business.
Or you cannot go to get a fucking
if they
haircut.
try to do a second.
Yeah, you cannot go to get a haircut.
And
but
if they try to.
But you can intermingle with
like,
thousands of people, yeah. It's
and then
it's
if
ridiculous.
they're going to try and enforce a second round of lockdowns, no one's going to accept it because the sheer hypocrisy. They're going to be so pissed off and tell you to straight up suck it.
Yeah, the thing was, people were first protesting about opening up their country and countries in certain other areas. They were even petitioning, like, oh, this COVID shit, it's kind of starting to die down. Can we please go back to normal because we want to eat? And then later on, it was like, oh, protests. But before that, everyone on the opposite side of those people wanting to open up were going like, oh, you're going to kill us all. A week later, protests started, and everyone was like applauding these anti-racism protests. And there was even this tweet from, I think, a doctor or somebody like that. There's a bigger issue than COVID here, and that's racism. And while you can make an argument for that, considering COVID has kind of shown itself to be less than that dangerous when it comes to, for example, these protests. Like, okay, if you want to protest racial equality, then you're immune from the Rona. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's really, really stupid.
So now, if somebody actually tries to fine you or anything like that, when you just want to go out and have a drink or have a haircut because you haven't had your hair done for about 3, 4, 5 months, you can clearly tell them to go fuck themselves, because they've been letting people riot and loot in every city in the States. And let's not even mention the UK, which still has prohibitions for mass gatherings and such due to COVID.
It makes a nice argument. The mother of idiots is always pregnant. Yeah, that's a proverb I'm going to remember.
Yeah. So we can say Corona is dead. Cue crab rave. So it's just ridiculous, at least to me. So
It's
I think is that it? That's all we have to
today. If we can.
Oh, there was also one more thing that I wanted to mention. There's this little tidbit that came up, I think, yesterday. I sent you the link to it. So apparently in the US, they burnt down a embassy flag of Montenegro. The protesters burnt down the flag of Montenegro because, and I quote, "The name of the country is racist."
Oh, God.
Montenegro, an Adriatic republic in Europe that had its name for about a few hundred years.
Which actually doesn't have anything to do with the word Negro, apart from that it sounds similar.
It's in Latin.
Yeah, it literally just means black.
Yeah, imagine that. There's other languages. Mountain. Yeah, the reason why it's called Black Mountain is because of the thick forests it had, which, if you actually walked into them, were kind of dark.
You have a black forest in Germany.
Yeah, Schwarzwald. Yeah. Are they going to call the forests racist now?
Oh, I've seen people try that.
Have any trees.
I've seen people try that stunt. Yep. But it's only a few Facebook and Twitter comments. But still, yeah, people are going there.
Somebody should tell all of these racially inclined people that not everything has to do with race when it comes to the colors.
Yes.
I mean, for God's sake, it's like you see for example, a black painted car. It's like you ask the person, like, what color is that? Black. Are you telling this? Are you telling this car's race or something?
If for me, I was raised in the
It's
90s,
stupid.
and we were taught do not see any color. So for me, a person is a person, and I will judge them by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin.
Same.
Furthermore, why would you completely just hop onto that race hustling train? It's like, no, you're merely inflaming tensions.
I mean, for God's sake, we were educated to do the exact same. So yeah. Yeah, you quoted him before, but I just wanted to put it up on the screen because I think this speaks volumes. So I think that's it. This was a pretty short live stream.
Yeah, but it's a follow-up to another one where we already spoke about a lot of things.
Next one, I think it will be on Sunday if nothing comes up. So
it's mostly going to be about the Shaz and a few of those things because apparently the police has stated that they want that thing gone by the 20th. So
we're going to do it on the 21st.
After the things have concluded, and it's going to be...
Let's just see where it goes, and then we will comment on that one as well. The stream will hopefully feature Sado, who was in the comments section previously. So we'll see you then. We hope you stay safe. We hope you stay healthy, happy, etc. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.